welcome if you have just joined us. We're delighted this morning to be hosting the DAL Global Virtual Workshop. We've got some fantastic speakers and panelists lined up for you later on this morning, and obviously you've heard already from Tara kick us off this morning. I'm now thrilled to welcome the wonderful Fiona Ibáñez-Leach. Fiona is the head of diversity, inclusion and belonging at Walgreen Boots Alliance. She looks after all of the international markets and has had a huge amount of international experience, commercial experience, and worked for many leading global organizations prior to taking up the role of D&I at Walgreen Boots Alliance. We're going to be hearing this morning all about how to foster inclusion and the fact that actually it's everyone's business. And I think this is more important, even more so today, given the environment that we are living in and the fact that most of us are at home. So we must embrace inclusion. Welcome, Fiona.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for hosting the webinar today and for inviting me to speak on it. Firstly, also thank you to Tara. That was brilliant. I really enjoyed listening to your perspectives and your story. So as Layla says, I was keen to use the kind of next hour that we have to have a bit of a discussion between us around fostering inclusion, and that's my doorbell going, apologies, around fostering inclusion. It's a terminology that we use a lot. And, we talk about fostering an inclusive culture, fostering an inclusive climate, and it's absolutely the right strategic business imperative for organisations to be focusing on. But sometimes, as with many things to do with culture, it can feel so big, so nebulous, so ambiguous and kind of conceptual, that the risk is that we're not very clear about delineating how and delineating who is accountable for this. So hopefully the next kind of few slides that I'll start our discussion off with will kind of break down some of that, the concept around fostering inclusion and what it takes and who's accountable. And then I'd be really open to hearing your perspectives and your questions too. So as with anything, and as Simon Sinek articulates so brilliantly in his book, I think it's always important to start with why. And this isn't just about regurgitating the business case for diversity and inclusion. It's really about a couple of things. One, reminding ourselves that diversity and inclusion aren't interchangeable terms. They are two different strategic business imperatives that serve distinct purposes, and you can see that from the body of research and studies that's been done behind the impact that they have in a business context. And two, also it's about why now. So why does this matter now in the context of a global pandemic, in the context of working more remotely, in the context of potentially cost saving many organizations. So I just wanted to underline that point as we start. We know that diverse organizations have been consistently shown to drive value in terms of financial returns, in terms of improved innovation outcomes, in terms of improved profit. But more recently, over the last few years, that the research has also dialed up in terms of the value of an inclusive culture itself. And Tara was speaking a bit to this in her talk just before. What we've seen from the research, and all of this, by the way, is source linked in the pack, which I think can be circulated afterwards or accessible on the hub on Dial Global, so you can read into some of the detail if you've not seen it previously. But what it really tells us, and some of the numbers that really speak to me, are that inclusive cultures are 6 times more likely to be innovative and agile. And what more useful organization skill set could we have than innovation and agility at a time of crisis management, at a time of massive change and uncertainty, as we go into what people keep calling the new normal. Inclusive cultures have also been shown to be 8 times more likely to achieve better business outcomes on a whole range of different measures, both people and performance related, and twice as likely to exceed financial targets, whether they are kind of revenue generating or cost saving targets. So this is a strategic business imperative, and it has a clear purpose absolutely in good times, but almost more importantly in times of adversity, of uncertainty or of change. As we move on. if we kind of are clear on the why, then it's also important to define what we actually mean by inclusive culture. And different organizations will have different definitions. And some of the studies that I shared with you a moment ago have their own definitions too. Our definition of DOBA is quite closely aligned to the definition from the Deloitte research. So we really are asking ourselves, do our team members experience a sense of belonging in the organisation where they can be themselves, to Tara's point earlier? And do they know that their ideas and opinions are valued, and that leaders are seeking to hear those opinions? Do they feel within their teams or functions that they're working together towards a common goal and they can kind of match their work to that purpose? And do they believe that we are one organisational team, so that we're not just after our own interests, but actually that we're working collectively? And a lot of our focus has been on the first two bubbles, really, but here's how we define inclusion. And we thought it was important to define inclusion because that means that we can start to measure it. Some of the ways that we've sought to measure it are through engagement surveys. So we have a globally aligned engagement survey in Walgreens Boots Alliance, and within that we've partnered across teams to embed an inclusion index. So they are 2 items that for us give us a more tangible quantitative measure of how inclusive our organisation feels. It's a relatively new index, and therefore we've got kind of a bit of benchmark baseline data that we can use. The other way we seek to measure it is by asking our teams, and business resource groups, which we've had in the business for some time and we've started to bring to the international markets more recently, are also a really good way of gaining valuable feedback around how inclusive our organisation is and our practices and our culture are for people from different parts of the community, and when you look at it from different perspectives, so we're not always assessing our culture from one perspective. And then finally, we measure it through workforce analytics. You know, you can have the inclusion index and you can have this ambition and strategic aim around inclusive culture, and you can engage your business resource groups. But if ultimately, over time, the representation in leadership roles, the hires, the promotions, the diversity on shortlists is lacking or isn't being shown, there is something still systemically that isn't inclusive necessarily. So it's important to have that quantitative piece to work with the qualitative feedback too. So given that we are clear on why it matters, we're clear on how we define it and how we measure it, therefore, where does the accountability really lie? And I've found it useful to think about it in kind of 3 key buckets. So from an organizational perspective, it really comes down, in my mind, to processes and platforms. So how do we ensure that there are nudges for inclusion, inclusive nudges and intentional diversity strategies in the way that we manage people and just how we do things in the organization and how we make business decisions so that our outputs are inclusive and representative of our teams? And then how do we create platforms to amplify the voice of diverse perspectives within our organizations, be that the business resource groups that I mentioned earlier, sometimes called employee resource groups or affinity networks, or be that through the Global Inclusion Council, for example, that we established last year, which seeks to really act as an advisory board for the D&I team globally to ensure what we're proposing is relevant, simple and applicable. So that's kind of the organizational context. So we'll dive into these a bit more in a moment. Then there's the leadership context. How do we take it away from it being diversity inclusion being seen as an HR accountability or a diversity inclusion accountability even, but actually it being seen as a collective responsibility like any other strategic business imperative where the tone really needs to be set from the top. And for us, that's meant actually embedding a performance goal for the top 300 leaders in the organization, focused around both increasing representation of diversity in leadership, but also being accountable for activities that will foster an inclusive climate. And then the third bucket, which I think is really important and probably we'll spend most of our time in a moment centered on, is around the individual accountability. So in my time working in diversity and inclusion, a lot of the conversations that I've encountered with people is people feeling like it doesn't apply to them for a number of reasons. It might be, I don't feel like I fit into one of the categories of diversity and inclusion, or one of the dimensions. People have felt it's just about gender and ethnicity, and therefore it doesn't speak to them, and have felt that their initial reaction is actually it's an exclusive, or it doesn't apply to them because they just see the individual. They don't see the different characteristics that makes them them. They don't have any biases, and therefore how can it affect me? Or thirdly, actually, I'm just one person in an organization of over 340,000 people. How can I possibly impact or influence change? It needs something bigger than me as an individual. And what we're trying to move towards is actually to really highlight the power and the role that we all have as individuals to shape how it feels to come to work every day for those around us. So from a people and processes perspective, for us, this has meant looking at inclusive executive talent acquisition, talent management. So how do we do an end-to-end process review? How do we do an end-to-end process review of each of our processes, and how do we keep ourselves accountable by reporting progress to the board so that we can kind of continually check on progress? When we think about leadership development, how do we think about diversity and inclusion education not as a separate add-on or as a standalone piece necessarily, but actually integrated and embedded into how we develop leaders and how we expect each of us to lead within the organisation, turning kind of what has been a big focus on awareness into action. From a performance management perspective, I mentioned we now have a goal in place for our leaders across the organisation. We've also established this Global Inclusion Council, which I mentioned earlier is a different group of leaders from across the organisation that can help keep our plans relevant and actionable. And then the business resource groups, who really are the voice of our workforce on the one hand and help us shape how it feels to work at Walgreens Boots Alliance, but on the other hand are a really key insight into our customers and our consumers, and help us think about how we better serve the needs of those consumers.
Fiona, just a couple of quick questions which I think
Sure.
would be appropriate to ask now, and you may well cover them, so apologies.
Yeah.
I've had a couple of people who are working in the field of diversity and inclusion already for leading global businesses, who are trying to drive forward more employee resource groups, or as you call them, business resource groups, and wondering whether you might be able to just talk through a little bit the different types of groups that you have and the rationale that you had when it came to setting up those particular groups. And one other question, so I don't throw you off as well, completely off the presentation, is someone, I'm not going to mention the name of the business just in case, but they are a leading global business. They sit in the FTSE and can't get budget sign-off for a D&I manager in their organization, which I know this organization, and bless them, I think it's pretty unbelievable actually given the size of the business, but they're struggling because it's quite an archetypal type of leadership, very in fact, I won't say which country because it will be obvious, but they are, a business that has, quite typically, lots of accountants at board level and such like, and very, very stuck in their ways, and very difficult for this particular HR director to try and get budget. And she says herself she just can't manage to take on D&I as well. She wants to drive it, but it's very difficult. She needs some more support. So any advice on that side as well?
Okay, big questions. So from a business resource group perspective, we've had about 10 different business resource groups established in the US for some time now, and they've been successful and have grown over time. What we wanted to do for the international markets, and just for context, that for us includes Chile, Mexico, some markets in Asia, and across Europe as well, we wanted it to feel really employee-led and relevant for the locations where we were launching them. So for us, the focus has been on sharing information as to if you feel there's a gap here and you would like to be involved in a group that doesn't exist, get in touch with us. And then we wait to get a bit of a critical mass, mostly of kind of at least 5 to 10 employees that come forward to say, actually, I've seen a gap here and we'd like some support. And then we nurture that group to give them the governance and the guidelines and the frameworks around establishing a business resource group. What's been really key for that is that level of governance. I'm not usually a huge fan of governance, but I think where it works well is we have a very clear structure. So every group must have an executive sponsor. It must have an elected chair and vice chair, and then a leadership team that goes with that. To represent the members' interests. And the reason that's worked well is that it allows for two things. One is for it to really closely link to the D&I strategic framework, so that you've not got a group over here not well connected with D&I and not all working to dial up the same aspect of diversity or inclusion. While still giving employees and team members the voice that they need and the platform they need to be innovative and to think of new ideas. And then the other way that governance has worked well is actually just for continuity reasons. So if people leave the business or whatever, some of our learnings from the US and also from external organizations is that if it's not that properly governed, it can then fizzle out, and that can be really disappointing for members over time. So I'd say the first place to start would be actually just get some guardrails around it to just understand what is a business resource group for you, define it for your organization, and how will you keep it connected into the broader D&I strategy? And then how do you get that information around out to employees around how to start a business resource group and where they see that there are gaps? The second thing that's worked for us is we call them business resource groups, to your point, Layla, because we want them to be very linked to how we operate. So it's still quite new for us, but what we don't want them to just be are networks of people that meet without clear purpose or direction. So they should be really aligning behind strategies that are going to support those communities within our workforce, and also linking to business processes that are going to support those communities within a potential workforce externally or potential consumers and customers externally. So I hope that helps some of the BRGs. And to date, we have a Pride Alliance group focused around the LGBTQ plus community, which have really helped shape some of our policy thinking, drive engagement, drive awareness about the large spectrum of identities within that group, and also support Pride events externally and in Pride charities. We've got a BAME BRG focused on the BAME community that's just established. We've got a Women of WBA BRG that works closely with the global group, centered on lots of different topics around gender inclusivity. And also we've got a group around inclusive IT. So this is around really encouraging diversity in STEM environments. More recently, a slightly different approach that we took for disability inclusion, because we saw that often disability was one where people didn't feel comfortable initially putting their neck on the line to say, hey, I think there's a gap here. And it's also strategically something we want to make sure that we're focusing earlier on in our agenda. We've actually started that group centrally, and then we've asked for people to come forward either as allies or as people with lived experience of disability to help us get that started. And then conscious that was a long answer, but I hope that helped, and happy to kind of follow up on that. And then the second aspect around getting the budget for a D&I manager role and not having the capacity to take it on. I feel your pain. I kind of went through that similar experience originally, and actually the way that we started a diversity and inclusion team in the part of the organization that I work in is after a lot of conversations and writing a paper with a colleague to outline the opportunity. I'd say if the issue is with wanting to do anything on D&I at all, then that's a bigger concern. If it's on budget and resourcing, I think there are still some places to start, and I think BRGs are a good place to start with that, because what we've found is there's a lot of latent energy and enthusiasm and innovation and ideas within the employee workforce of people that can make improvements and make things happen over time and create a bit of a groundswell really from the team member base, which could over time give you more data points to be able to illustrate to the leadership. For conscious of time, so I'd be really happy with whoever has put that question forward, conscious of the kind of sensitivity around it and not want to talk about it in a public forum. I'd be really happy to have a one-on-one discussion if they'd want to think about other ways in which without the resource they could start to get the ball rolling. Even now, although I'm dedicated to diversity and inclusion, I cover the international markets, which is around 150,000 people, something like that. So it's still, being resourceful is still a really key skill I think that we need within D&I anyway. So I'd be happy to share some of the tips that have worked well there.
Wonderful. Just one more question, sorry,
Sure.
from Gareth, who's actually online at the moment. I'm interested to know as a business how you drive the education piece, for example, unconscious bias training. Because it's all about admitting that there are inefficiencies in this area, and a lot of businesses he's worked with really don't like to admit, in inverted commas, these failings, for want of a better word.
Yeah, no, really good question. So we have, we're just for context, we're a fairly decentralized organization in part. So we operate in lots of different divisions and lots of different, or quite a few different industries as well. So the first thing I'd say that's been useful is to use a kind of D&I maturity curve to establish where those different businesses are in terms of their awareness and readiness for diversity and inclusion strategies to be deployed, and it could be useful to do the same in whatever business Gareth is working in at the moment, maybe by function or by team if it's not so kind of divided into divisions, because then you can tailor something really relevant. But in most instances, we've developed and deployed unconscious bias e-learning as a kind of core element that is linked to induction or onboarding of individuals. And so when they join, we're starting to prompt that thinking early on. My personal belief is that unconscious bias training alone won't do much. We always get good feedback on unconscious bias training or prompts, because it is thought-provoking and it's interesting. But what we've been more focused on recently is around how do you turn that into action. And I think the more it can be addressed from an opportunity perspective and kind of just a perspective to say, it isn't whether you want to engage on this or not. We are all biased, and unless we do something to actively manage that bias, here are the risks to the organisation, and here's the opportunity that we're missing out on, rather than it feeling like a stick that you're beating them with. I found that to be more engaging, and so we've built on that foundational piece around unconscious bias, but with some micro inequities training, which is all about the power of the small actions that you can take day in, day out. It's the things that you don't say, it's the tone you use, it's the looks that you give, it's the sense that you're not in the in-group. How do you foster through small actions a more inclusive climate in that sense? So it's more action oriented. And then really, as I was saying earlier, embedded modules around inclusive leadership and what that looks like into leadership development programs, so that it just becomes not oh, okay, well, you've got this bias and, you need to recognize you've got an issue and so you need to do this about it. But it just becomes almost flipped on its head. Here's how we lead in this organization, and the inclusive leadership, it needs to be at the heart of that. Great. So that was kind of the organizational piece. Thank you, Gareth. That was the organizational piece. As we move on to the second element piece. So this kind of links a little bit to what Gareth was getting at too, I think. One of the things I've observed as a D&I professional to be more powerful is to think about partnering with leaders as the first step. It's a partnership. I think what I've observed not work effectively previously is for D&I in a silo to come up with, this is what we should be doing, this is what the organisation should be, what should look like in terms of diverse representation, and this is what leaders should be accountable for. Here you go, leaders, off you go. And actually, that's not effective. It's not a partnership. And I think for me, I think of being a D&I lead as as being an HR partner focused on diversity and inclusion. So it's how do we really partner with a leader initially to understand their context. You know, I mentioned about the D&I maturity curve earlier. I think that's one step. I think there's also let's park D&I completely for a second. Let me understand your business. What are your challenges? What are your commercial objectives? What are your people objectives more broadly? And then I think it gives you an inroad and a base level of understanding to be able to then educate leaders to say, well, actually, you're focused on X and Y. Here's how increased diversity in that team could support that. And here's how these actions on inclusive climate could really support and enable your goals. So we make D&I relevant. I think the other thing, like with any strategic business imperative, it's to measure. And that's where the diversity and inclusion goal has been really helpful for us. Just full disclosure, getting hold of consistent data globally is challenging, especially because we do operate across different divisions. But we have prioritized initially our leadership population so that we can track what the makeup of that leadership population looks like by area. And that gives leaders something to fall back on and to review like they would with any other strategic business intervention. And then I think the two areas that we've started to do, but certainly as an organisation we could definitely do more of and improve on, is around incentivising and celebrating. So how, incentivising really linking to the business case in some areas, linking to whatever you've found out through that partnership that it matters to that leader. You know, is it about talent retention? Is it about better consumer insight? Is it about better engagement within the organization? So what's the real incentive for that leader? And then when somebody does it really well, when you're kind of blown away by how inclusive somebody is leading, or an inclusive project that you observe, how do you shout about that? Because one of the things that we talked about at the beginning of this presentation was about inclusive leadership being nebulous, inclusive culture being nebulous. And so the more you can bring it to life by saying, hey, this leader did this in this way, and that was super inclusive and got these amazing results, it helps to actually incentivize more of that behavior from the rest of the leadership. And then we talked about the third bucket, which is about the individual accountability. And I quite like this quote. I forget who it's from. But it's, if not you, then who? If not now, then when? And this is really about, I think, Tara, you might have mentioned it as being getting comfortable with being uncomfortable or something like that. And I totally agree with that. It is easy to say, do you know what, Layla, that wasn't very inclusive when you did that. I observed this, and I think you should think about that differently. It's easy to say that. It's quite hard to say, I was really, not inclusive in that conversation I just had, and I really dismissed that person's idea. But I tell you, if we all did that, I think it would make a massive shift in how it feels to work at home. And I don't say this from a position of having got it perfectly right. Okay, so I do think we have some structure here around what helps, and I think that I'd split it into two areas: so awareness and allyship. So from an awareness perspective, I would thoroughly recommend starting with self-awareness. For me, it still feels uncomfortable. It still feels like, oh God, I should be getting it right every time. And I won't get it right every time. And I feel comfortable with that as long as I'm always wanting to learn. I was sharing with Layla earlier in the week. I know I have a massive tendency to interrupt people. My ego tells me that it's because I'm excited about their ideas and I want to build on it and I want to get to the solution and I want to make up a plan. But the reality is that I'm undermining what that person is saying, and I'm taking away their chance to really voice their idea and to help bring it to life for others. And so as uncomfortable as that feels, and as much as I wish I could just take that away, without having that realization, I can't then be intentional about how I address it. So there's something about being self-aware and being quite as objective and critical as you can be, to think about how would I have felt on the other side of that, because then I can think about, well, when do I tend to do that? Well, I tend to do that in fairly small group discussions. Okay, when are my next small group discussions, and what am I going to do before those to set an intention, to keep stum until somebody's finished verbalizing and articulating their idea. I'll go on to in a moment some tips on how to start with that self-awareness piece, because I think it is tricky, and I think it speaks a little bit to what Gareth was saying too about how do we get people to even acknowledge there's a challenge or an issue. I've got some exercises that can be helpful as well, so I'd be happy to follow up with anybody interested that would like to kind of facilitate those exercises with their leadership teams. But self-awareness, if you do nothing differently as a result of today or as a result of exploring diversity and inclusion, it would be to be aware of how you act. And I really labour the point because while kind of we can feel a certain way about an organisation, or we can feel like the organisation doesn't value X, Y, and Z, or seems to place too much importance on Y, most of how you feel day to day comes from the daily interactions that you have with your team members, whether it's remotely or face to face, with your manager, with your peers. And if you make a concerted effort to, in every one of those interactions, be self-aware and be inclusive, that's going to already have had an impact on a lot of people in their day-to-day experience. I think then and only then do we have some of the tools to be aware of what's happening around us. And there is a lot of power in the the position of the observer. So I'm sure we've heard this example before. We can all think of times when we've been in a meeting and, you know, Anita has made a point and I raising an idea. We've all kind of nodded along sort of vacantly. And then later, you know, 5 minutes later, John articulates the same idea, just slightly differently, to vigorous head nods. And we think, yes, amazing idea, John. I think this would really work. And we attribute the idea to John. And you know, as an observer, actually, Anita had just mentioned that a minute ago, but we're going with what John's saying. And there's a lot of power in actually taking that observation and then stepping up to do something with that information. And that's just one small example. And that's what I think leads us to allyship. It's about taking observations and actually acting upon them. So in that instance, it might be saying, great idea, John. I think it's very similar to what Anita just mentioned. Anita, is that what you were thinking? That shifts the power back to Anita, gives the voice back to her to be able to articulate what she wanted to share, and also acknowledges that there had been a misattribution there of the idea, of crediting of the ideas. The other thing about allyship and linked to self-awareness is that we don't only need to work on self-awareness from a behavioural perspective, but also from a privilege perspective. You know, we can feel uncomfortable talking about privilege because as an individual, I know all the good things that have happened to me, definitely, and a lot of those would have been born from the privilege that I have. But I also know all the bad things that have happened to me, and that my life experiences and my hardships, you know, be it family dynamics or financial things or, you know, socioeconomic status. And so when somebody talks to me about privilege, it might jar with me, because it might feel like, well, I don't feel like I lead a privileged life. The reality is we all carry some level of privilege in one way or another, because we are made up of a whole host of different dimensions of diversity and diverse perspectives, diverse backgrounds. And the more we allow ourselves to recognize the aspects where we do carry privilege, the more power we hold in being able to be really great, effective allies for those around us. And so, you know, it links, I think, a little bit to gratitude. What am I really lucky to have access to, what to have had the platforms to be able to do? And how can I use some of that power to speak up and support others and be shoulder to shoulder with others? The final thing I'll say on just allyship is sometimes I think being an ally can seem intimidating, because it can be received as knowing how to do everything right, how to say the right thing, how to not say the wrong thing, how to avoid offending somebody. I don't think of allyship that way. I think of allyship as being using my self-awareness, which I need to continue to work on, to also get to be curious and learn about others, and to just seek to understand another person's perspective. And the more I understand, the more I can then use any of the opportunities that I have to speak up or to advance a certain person's perspective within an organisation for the better. So it's not about having all the answers, it's about having the right intent and the right active listening mode to be able to then use that insight to be more effective as an individual in creating an inclusive climate around you. Just a final couple of slides. So where can you start as an accountable individual? There are a few resources that I would signpost to first. So if you're interested in the idea of allyship, there's a really good TED talk. I can't remember who it's by, but it's called 3 Ways to Become a Better Ally. Layla, and actually I can send you the link out later to forward on to everybody. I think it's about 10 minutes long, but it really brings to life the kind of breaking it down of why it matters and how to actually affect that allyship in the workplace. And then from an inclusive leadership and creating an inclusive climate perspective, EY released an article quite recently, probably about 4 months ago, something like that, called 30 Ways to Be Inclusive. And they are really small, practical starting steps. You know, we talked about the power of the small actions. I would start there. It's things like, you know, organising what would be an hour virtual coffee with somebody that you don't normally work with within your team. And actually, just by including 1 or 2 of those actions a week to start to build into your daily practice, I think it kind of builds your inclusive leadership muscle. And then finally, on an inclusive individual perspective, this is the model from Deloitte around the 6 traits of an inclusive leader, which some of you may have seen before. But it really centers, in terms of the big ideas, it's about being curious about others. So why is somebody thinking that this isn't a good idea, or that this other idea would work better? Where are they coming from? What's their perspective? Secondly, building your cultural intelligence muscle. You know, when we recognize that everything that we see, we inherently see through our own cultural frame, how can we build our knowledge and understanding of other cultural frames by increasing contact with people from other cultures, for example, so that we can think about things in a more holistic way. Thirdly, being really intentional about who you collaborate with and how. So it might be thinking about how you get to the people who tend to always be naysayers to your ideas, how you get to them earlier on to get their thinking and their perspectives. Why are they seeing something different than what you're seeing? Or if you're a leader in an organization or in a team, when you're next standing up a project, how can you be really intentional about ensuring that there are diverse perspectives around the decision-making table so that you can get to a more innovative and different outcome? The fourth piece is around committing to keeping inclusion on your plan. Seems really basic, but actually half of the battle is showing up, right? So keeping inclusion on the plan, even in times of change, even in times of ambiguity, of uncertainty, and in times of a global pandemic in itself, just that focus can have a real influence in terms of how it feels from an inclusive culture perspective. And then the final 2, I think, are fairly linked. So having the courage and humility to take risks, to be vulnerable, to learn from your mistakes, to you know, acknowledge when something hasn't been as inclusive as it should have been. And finally, knowing your own biases. So I don't know if you're familiar with the implicit association tests from Harvard, but they're free, accessible online, based on tons of research from Harvard. I can send the link out to them later, and you can use them yourselves and then with your leaders as well to identify where there are risks of inherent bias that you might want to address. And this is the final slide now. So from an organizational perspective, I've just left you with some thoughts around the kinds of activities that you might focus on when you're thinking about intentionally building an inclusive culture. So incentivizing and measuring leaderships via a goal linked to both diversity and inclusion, because they are 2 separate things, is a good way of setting the tone. Then having some sort of cultural ambassador via something like the Global Inclusion Council, so that you've got a voice of the business of the divisions that you work in that can keep you relevant and true to what you're hoping to achieve. Embedding inclusive leadership and unconscious bias into existing leadership development programs rather than as standalones, so it becomes just how we do things. Investing time and resources where you have them into BRG programs. And then finally, reviewing talent processes systematically with an inclusion lens rather than diversity being an afterthought. And that was everything from me. Thank you so much for listening and for the questions along the way. Happy to take any more questions, and also really happy to be connected on LinkedIn if anybody would like to kind of follow up separately.
Thank you ever so much, Fiona. That was fantastic. And there's some brilliant tools there. But what I love particularly was there's so many tools that can be utilized alongside other business practices, which I hope, I'm not, alienate is probably not the right word, but when people have so much to do in their day-to-day jobs, and sometimes I think as D&I practitioners, asking of more, people think, oh goodness, you know, how to get it top of the agenda, another thing to do. But actually, by bolting things onto the existing business practices that are there already and harnessing the power of many people, actually you can have a huge difference, and clearly you've proved that. So thank you very much indeed for sharing. Just moving to our chat for those who are actually online as well at the moment, we have a couple of questions around some of the tools and platforms. So there's someone here who is working in the insurance sector and asks, how can data and analytics help to push the inclusion strategy? And do you have any tips on how to, I think they mean how best to use the data here? And then another question around the tools again, and which platform Walgreen Boots Alliance is using to drive inclusion.
So platforms wise, what I was referring to really is creating the space for employees to have a voice. So for example, the business resource groups are a platform for it, and they meet regularly, and then we meet with the chairs regularly to understand that insight, because for us that is a really key data point, is what are those BRG members telling us isn't working, and what are they telling us we need to do more of or less of. So that answers a bit of both. Is it's one of a key platform, but it's also a really key data point, and I think it's one that it's hard for people who haven't previously seen the value of diversity and inclusion to argue with, because it's, your teams are telling us this, your teams are experiencing this, here are some real life examples. So I think I wouldn't underestimate the value of the qualitative feedback and data outputs that we can get from business resource groups, and that's one of our key platforms. Second key platform is the Global Inclusion Council. So this is made up of leaders who represent the different divisions and markets that we operate in. There's about 20 of them who meet at least quarterly to review kind of how we're doing on the inclusion index, how we're doing on diversity inclusion strategy, how they can bring inclusion to life within their respective divisions, and what additional support they need from us. And I think in a business where you might not have all of the resources that you would want to focus on diversity and inclusion, that's another key platform that can help accelerate some of the progress towards diversity and inclusion. And then for us, we've established a community of practice for diversity and inclusion too. So we have a representative from each of the divisions in the international markets. We meet on a monthly basis, and I chair a community of practice meetings to share best practice. What have we seen from the external market? What are some of the challenges we're finding in our teams? How are people addressing that? What are some of the learning programs that we were looking to deploy, and learning needs, and how do we collaborate effectively to accelerate progress, but also to look for efficiencies in how we work. So that's kind of the platforms piece. The data piece, I think sometimes I would say the lack of data can be used as a bit of a crutch to say, oh, we can't do this because we just don't have the data on this. And we do have some challenges around data capturing for some dimensions of diversity, particularly outside of the US. So I think getting hold of some tangible data is helpful for us. It's meant starting at leadership level, because what we could see is that our representation of women as consumers is really high, representation of women in the workforce is really high, and we see that start to tail off in leadership positions. So we want to be intentional about driving that forward too. So I think the key thing with data is to start somewhere on representation data. And then I think it's really important to then integrate it into people processes as much as possible. So how can you get data from existing practices? So if your organization is already doing talent reviews, for example, how can you add a diversity lens to the data that's collated from those talent reviews? Same with performance management. If your company gives performance management ratings, how can you add a diversity lens to that rating overview? to give you some tangible pieces to be able to say, well, actually, women in the organisation are far less likely to be on a succession plan for a role, and much less likely to be rated high performing within the year. So what can we do to address this? And it gives you some kind of tangible pieces to focus on. The only other thing I just wanted to add on the data side of things is linked to the piece around partnering leaders and getting to know their world a bit more, is actually a blanket approach to data probably won't work. So there is something to be said for having at corporate level some key goals or ambitions that you're aiming for. But then I think what has been quite effective is to get to know the individual leaders for those divisions or functions to understand what matters to them. And then that can help inform what your key metric or data point should be. So it might be that it's about retaining talent, or it's about attracting talent, and therefore it helps you know how to use data in the most effective way.
So someone was being very complimentary and just saying they loved hearing the talk, but they were curious to know about how things were changed during the COVID-19 outbreak.
Yes.
And what's been the biggest challenge for D&I during this time specifically?
Yes, really good question, really relevant question. So things have changed from my role perspective in a couple of ways. And I think you tend to find this a lot in big global organizations, is that the D&I strategies tend to have been US born. And my role as an international markets lead has only been quite a recent role. And so I'm often joining my team in the US remotely, and I'm the only one joining remotely. And that feels a certain way. And so now that everybody's working remotely, in a way, from a personal perspective, I feel kind of more connected to the team. Which is a kind of a silver lining from all of this. I think in terms of the nature of the work that we're focusing on, it's been a really good opportunity to reassess what we're doing. So there's a couple of things. One is we're looking at our strategy to make sure that whatever we're doing is relevant during and post this period in what everybody's calling the kind of new normal. And to do that, we're taking quite an employee-centric approach. So we have some ideas around what we think is going to be most relevant, but then we're going to be checking that with our business resource groups, with our Global Inclusion Council, with our community of practice, to make sure that D&I is still really closely linked and embedded with the business agenda. And then I think there's some interesting and concerning stats coming out about the over impact of COVID-19 on certain minority communities. And I think we have to do some more work around that as a team. We're intrigued to do some more work around that, to really understand that and see how we need to support that from an organisational perspective. And I think that's probably about it. And then from a personal perspective, just juggling actually home, being with a 4-year-old, and everybody being at home in a chaotic environment and still trying to get things done. Sorry, the final thing I'd say on just COVID-19 is we have more recently started to think about how do we balance some of the COVID-19 news with some positive celebrations of the diversity that we have within our team. So we will be celebrating, for example, World Day for Cultural Diversity in May, but in a digital format that really speaks to the fact that we're all going through a really shared human experience, regardless of whether you're in Chile or the UK or in Norway. And so, yeah, look out for that, because I think that's been a good way of kind of uplifting spirits and recognising some of the community benefits that have come out from this, if nothing else. So I'm Fiona Ibáñez-Leach, Head of Diversity and Inclusion for International Markets of Walgreens Boots Alliance, and please stay safe during this time.
Thank you ever so much. And thank you very, very much indeed for taking all of those questions so articulately, as you always do. It's been brilliant having you, and I think there's some excellent pieces there that we can all embed across the entire board. I think what was brilliant about the presentation was, as I said, this is very doable for people across the board within business, and it should be bolted on to existing business practices. It's a way to further that. So whichever areas or whichever sectors, whether it be the insurance sector or the sporting sector that you work in, there's some real tools there that we can all utilize and harness, and don't feel you have to do it by yourself. So thank you very much indeed, Fiona. And don't worry if you missed anything. We'll put everything online. It will be on the COVID-19 support hub as well with Dial at www.dialglobal.org. Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.